Good morning, everyone. So, being the speaker that goes on right before lunch, I should like to keep my remarks brief so that we can all head to some great Venetian food. I'm a third-year student of anthropology at the University of California in Davis. And what I'm sharing with you today are basically some findings that some hypotheses that I have that I've come up with over 2 summers of preliminary fieldwork that I have conducted in Kunming, China. So I'd greatly appreciate any kind of feedback that you may have, especially today when we have such a wealth of fields between the speakers in this great event. So with that said, I'd like to start my presentation with a little bit of context. These are some quotations from the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping. And we can see here, this is just a small selection, but we can see that it has become increasingly common for Xi Jinping to call for this kind of newfound connection and strengthening of a relationship of Chinese urbanites or Chinese developed educated people with some of their generally understood as traditions or some of their historical practices. And I think that that needs to be understood in the context of as China enters its so-called Chinese Dream period, which is both characterized by its newfound middle class discovering its aspirations and its own processes of individualization. And on the other hand, it's also characterized by a particular kind of economic slowdown that China is facing right now. So it's interesting to notice that one of the consequences of Chinese Dream has been actually this kind of newfound interest in some of the country's oldest historical practices. And in this context, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization published last year a report looking at the medium-term development of the tea market. And it places China at the forefront of both consumption and production. And it points out two specific reasons for that. One being the discovery of health benefits from drinking different kinds of tea, and another one being what they call a long-standing tradition of drinking tea in the country. So, of course, that I believe that it is important to understand these new desires in the context of China's changing political economy and the desires that new drinkers have to embody categories such as the ancient and the artisanal and tradition, as well as some critical junctures where these capacities are enacted being specifically derived from changes in the political economy. But I would argue as well that in order for us to understand tea drinking in China today, we should also consider the possibility that the capacities of tea might not just lie in its value as a culturally meaningful commodity and in the benefits that it brings health-wise. But it might also be related to a number of related obligations and entanglements that happen between the self, the other, and nature. And so it is in this context that China kind of starts entering its period of tea fever, right? And in this recent period of tea fever that has been going on for roughly the past 15 to 20 years, a number of tea art or chai courses started becoming more prominent, especially in southern China. So here I have a small selection of two of my main interlocutors. And these tea art courses, they are generally devised by self-styled tea masters that range in background all the way from tea science to artists and people with religious engagements. So on the left here is Mabol from DiscoverCha. And Mabol has both a bachelor's and a master's in tea science from the Huazhong Academy. And she offers an iterative tea art course that takes place over 4 weekends in Kunming. And I took the course with her a number of times, and for the last iteration, I was her teaching assistant, so to speak. And Mabel is very concerned with the standardization of tea, and specifically the standardization of the pu'er tea industry. And she represents one specific approach that urbanites have to tea today. But on the right, there's Shana from the International Tea Academy. And Shana also deals a lot with tea art, and she writes a lot of books. And This particular book, I found it interesting because it talks about the Wuxing theory, right? The theory of the 5 elements, and how these elements might be connected to our drinking of tea, right? So in general, we can see that tea art as a phenomenon, it encompasses a number of endeavors, all the way from a subjective aesthetic connection or aesthetic relation with tea, all the way to a modern acquisition of hard matters effects relating to tea production, tea tasting, and different techniques. And I think that this slide helps paint that a little bit, because we can see that on the left is a slide from one of Mabol's tea courses. And you can see that the constellation of terms that she's dealing with there is primarily derived from modern food science, right? We're talking about tea polyphenols, tea flavoring. And on the right is a page from 5-element tea, right? And which is talking about how, again, the Wuxing theory relates to Kung Fu brewing, the kind of brewing that we were doing right here, right? So as an anthropologist that is committed to empirical philosophy, I'm not interested in taking one of these interpretations to be the correct one and one of these to be the wrong one. But I'm interested in thinking of both of them as ways to engage with reality, and both of them as ontologies, or as I would call worldings. And I believe that even though this is quite a caricature of an example, I'd say that all tea art courses are in fact composed of a combination of these 2 kinds of elements. And so it is in that context that my questions are, how is tea art enabling people to just change their lives and just change everyday living? And perhaps would tea art be part of larger endeavors to reconnect with nature and the ethical person, a kind of break, a self-perceived break that has happened in the so-called rush to riches of the post-reform period in China? And so to ask these questions, I conducted field work, and as an anthropologist, I am also an ethnographer. So I've done field work in Kunming. For those who don't know, Kunming is the capital of the Yunnan province. And tea is a very important substance for Yunnan. It's not only central to the cultures of many of the ethnic minorities of Yunnan, but it's also an important piece of Yunnan's gift economy, and also an important self-making tool of contemporary urbanites today in Kunming. So my main sites of participant observation were the Xiongda tea market, where I worked at a tea shop. The bottom picture is the Xiongda market. So tea markets, or chachengs, they are these sprawling compounds with these, every 2 doors of glass is one tea shop. So they have tea shops or galleries or workrooms or just studios where different companies will hold tea tasting events. And companies that produce tea, or companies that produce products that are related to tea, such as water filters and things like that, and also different kinds of religious, spiritual engagements are explored in these tea tasting events. So besides DiscoverCha and International Tea Academy, I also worked at the Xiongda Tea Market. And I'm gonna pepper this presentation with some of my fieldwork pictures, and I thought it was pretty interesting to put that one on the top. That's Mabol laughing at me, and just telling all of my classmates, which were in front of her, that I've displayed an incorrect gender performance when I was drinking tea. When I was holding the cup, a move that is normally called 3 dragons protect the cup, I left my pinky finger out, and apparently that is a specifically feminine way of drinking tea, and that was very funny for them. So that was my very rough crash course into discovering the particularly gendered ways of being elegant by drinking tea. So with that, who cares about tea art? Who's drinking tea art? Who's doing tea art? And so this is a picture from our graduation in the first iteration of the tea art course that I've taken. Mabel is the one in the bottom row wearing brown, and to her left, I'm left-handed, is Wendy, the owner of the tea shop who I worked on. And her narrative for becoming a tea shop owner was very interesting and was something that was very commonly deployed in the field. Wendy decided to become a tea shop owner and to drink more tea because she didn't want to be, quote, like all of those people who only care about money. And I found that to be very interesting because commonly people would say that to me on the field. And as you can see in this picture, there's also foreigners that were interested, that are increasingly interested in tea art. And just generally, and there are civil servants there, and there's also people that are thinking about opening their own tea shops. So with that said, I'm trying to think with my interlocutors of ways to think about concepts, not as a way to unearth the true social reality of what's happening beneath tea art, but rather as a way to perhaps use their concepts to think of an anthropology of tea itself, and an anthropology of tea arts in a way that might help us disrupt some Western hegemonic thinkings about some categories such as art. So the first one that I thought was interesting was guzhuo. So for the Chinese speakers in the room, it might be interesting to see this word here because it's generally translated as uncivilized or primitive or sometimes even uncouth, right? But it was a term that was commonly deployed in the field in order to denote a kind of authentic connection to nature. And an authentic connection to nature that can only be achieved when one is able to know tea or to dongcha. And so to know tea means more, from the get-go, for me meant more than just this technocratic acquisition of matters of fact relating to tea, but also a kind of aesthetic connection to nature, a kind of construction of a connection to nature. But it's also important to note that this connection has no theological element. It doesn't come from a particular theological order, right? In the sense that the transcendence of the individual doesn't look for a particular being that is monotheistic, right? So when Mabol told me that tea art has no way, I was wondering what she meant by that. And she particularly uses the term tea art or cha yi in opposition to cha dao, or the way of tea, indicating that there's not one particular way through which this connection with nature is achieved, but it is a very personal thing that is displayed through one's capacity to engage in different modes of sociality. And that indicates that there's a particular conceptual persona, and here I'm thinking about Gilles Deleuze and the Deleuzian conceptual persona as a particular virtual image that orients the becoming in the actual. And a lot of my interlocutors have deployed this term, the tea person, the charen, and I'm particularly putting in a hyphen there because I believe that this is a hyphenation, and as a hyphenation, it is a making, it is a doing, it is a bringing of the tea to the person. And all of my interlocutors, they did not say that they were tea people, but that they were becoming a tea person, that they were on their way to be a tea person, indicating that this is indeed perhaps a kind of conceptual persona as opposed to something that one achieves and one becomes, and that's it. So what ultimately this indicates for me is that there's a particular that exists between these entangled worldings that are non-commensurable but are intersecting nonetheless, right? And each of them brings a particular ecology of practice with them. So bringing some of my conceptualizations as an anthropologist, I'd like to think that tea is perhaps a companion species for China today. By companion species, here I'm drawing on post-human understandings from the philosopher Donna Haraway. And as a companion species, I mean that people attribute tea with a particular culturally specific agency and sense of subjectivity. And those capacities, in turn, are articulated into symbols and institutions and modes of relationality that ultimately orient connections between the self, the other, and nature, or different conceptualizations of nature. And so some of my conclusions, so to speak, or some of the hypotheses that I'm working with are that contrary to simply to I forgot to talk about technologies of the self. It just went through it, my bad. So I'm thinking with Foucault here, and I'm thinking as a Foucauldian technology of the self. Tea becomes closely associated with practices of self-cultivation and ethical practice in the everydayness. So it makes us think about ordinary ethics, but not as it has been commonly talked about in the literature, just as something that emerges as linguistic challenges that one deals with in the everyday. But I believe that tea art, or the relationality that is provided by tea, offers us a non-linguistic kind of ordinariness with which we're engaging in the everyday. And so, by way of conclusion, some of my quick hypotheses that I'm working with is that to talk about tea art is not to talk about the art of tea. It's not just a kind of way to relate to tea itself, but is an artistic mode and a generative platforms of relations sui generis. And what I mean by that is that it is a way through which it is a way through which a person can study and cultivate a relationship to tea that also subsumes relationship to others and relationships to oneself and relationships to nature. And in that sense, because when we think about terms like chai and guzhuo, we're thinking about tea not just as art, but also as a way to conceptualize, care for, and know nature itself, right? So, and all of that comes from this particular desire to escape this people who just want to care about money, right? So in that sense, it seems clear that tea art is like diffracting the human relation with tea across these intersecting spaces of artistic practice, ethical self-making, and epistemology, knowledge-making practices. And in that sense, therefore being a kind of relationship to a thing that makes one a thing as well and subsumes all kinds of relations, maybe we can talk about a kind of ecological aesthetics that emerges from tea as a kind of transcendence of a subject-object division that allows us to conceptualize ourselves in nature in the same kind of standing, in the sense that may create new kinds of modes of citizenship in contemporary China. So with that said, I try to be very quick. Thank you.